Hi there. Welcome. Welcome to our panelists. Welcome to our audience. Welcome to a webinar we are calling Team Building Demystified, Strategies and Tactics for Finding and Keeping Great People. Clearly, that is the responsibility of all entrepreneurs and managers at various levels, but that isn't always their core expertise. And so we're lucky to be talking today with two very experienced executive recruiters who have worked with entrepreneurs and executives of all kinds, all stripes, companies of all sizes, all within the med tech space. So Mike Travis and Drue DeAngelis are with us today to talk through some of the issues in this area. We're going to cover a handful of things today, if time allows. Certainly, we're going to focus on the differences in hiring practices for smaller versus larger firms. We're going to talk about the importance of culture, how to figure out what it is, how to work within it, how to bring new people into it. We're going to talk about some of the more tactical issues of how to write an effective spec. Some of the mistakes that folks make that Drue and Mike have seen more than a few times, and I think throughout we'll talk about how to work with a search firm, and really I'd like to explore how one can do that, as a partner rather than as a one-off transaction. I think many of us think about calling in the experts when we have a certain problem to solve, but I think Drue and Mike will make a case for and explain a little bit how search firm partners can be partners. So that's what we're going to do today. Before we do that, however, we have some polling questions we would like to put to you, our audience. Just four of them, just to give us a little bit better sense of who we're talking to in the live webinar. This webinar is being recorded and available forever. But at least for this group, we're going to ask you four things. Number one is, are you a first-time founder? I think clearly there are some issues for first-time founders that there may not be for more experienced entrepreneurs or managers in larger companies. What stage is your company today? Is it a startup? Is it a growing company? Is it a mature company? Third, have you worked with an executive search firm in your current company? And then fourth, what's your biggest fear when you engage in recruiting? Is it cultural fit, competency, character, talent? Those are at least your options. So we'll see what people say. So you can go ahead and put those polling questions up and feel free to answer them. And then we will have a better sense of with whom we are speaking. So while we're doing that, I'd like to do some quickish introductions. First of all, I'll let you know who I am and get out of the way. My name is Randy. I work with the Focused Ultrasound Foundation Partners Program, which is really focused on the commercial realm of focused ultrasound therapeutics. As you probably know, the foundation has been a powerful benefactor of research and convening the research community as well as the payer and provider community for awareness and just pushing the field forward. But a few years ago, it became clear that if we didn't also work directly with the folks building businesses in this area, that may go from being an enabling to a gating factor. And so Partners Program tries to stay current on all the different businesses in the ecosystem globally in focused ultrasound therapeutics. That includes talking to folks with money. That includes talking to folks who can be various enablers of service providers too. And one of the things we observed in our interaction with all the different companies at different stages was a clear common thread, which is that, gosh, finding, retaining great talent is never easy. It's never not a problem. It's never not an opportunity for all the companies we work with. That's whether they're publicly traded or it's two guys and a dog. So that's why we thought it'd be great to get Drue and Mike to join us today to talk through their experiences and particularly how they think companies like ours might think about executive recruiting. So that's my role. Perhaps, Mike, if you could lead it off and tell us a bit about Travis and Company, and particularly how you got into this field and why you like it, and how you think about it, and then we can ask Drue the same thing.
Yeah, thanks, Randy. So my name is Mike Travis. I run an executive search firm called Travis and Company based in the Boston area. We focus on medical devices, and under that umbrella, probably do half of our work with very small emerging companies, call it 0 to 50 million in revenue. And the other half of our business is with medium and large size companies. I got into this business about 25 years ago. Longer than I care to admit. And I discovered I really liked it. What's fascinating about doing search, especially in the medical device field, is the ability to see lots of very interesting technologies and interesting people who work in the industry. And that's what's kept me at it.
Makes sense. Great. Thank you. Drue, tell us about your practice and how you got into it.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Drue DeAngelis and founder, managing partner of the DeAngelis Group. And my history in the medical device industry goes back 34 years. Worked my first 10 years of my career for a company called Zimmer in sales, and then was recruited by Stryker to start their Arizona branch. And that was 25 plus years ago. And then after that, I entered into a world of recruiting, and it was attractive to me because it was people-centric, and it's always been my passion to help people. And there's no greater way to do that than helping companies find great talent and really find that unique fit of a person with their right competency, character, and chemistry. And so it's been a passion of mine for 22 years. And I work with almost exclusively small to mid-size companies, and all within medtech.
Terrific. Yeah, there's a couple of themes there already. One I'm hearing is tech and people. Certainly, companies are, especially in the medical device world, companies are often formed around some intellectual property or some technology. And it's very easy for managers and investors alike to get focused on those shiny objects. I think that's one of the reasons we're here today, is to help folks focus on the people stuff as well. And then the other theme is really size and stage of business. I think it seems obvious that there should be some different approaches or practices with regard to building a team. And I guess I'd like to start out there, if we could, and really first, let's talk through the sort of the needs of smaller versus larger companies, the constraints they may have. What are the differences, and how do you see managers struggling with them, and how do you help them identify those differences or constraints, when you engage? I'll throw it open to either of you.
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay. So maybe I'll describe two recent engagements, one for a small company and one for a large company, and that might help to illustrate the different ways that these companies approach the process, and also the challenges they have to deal with. So in a recent search for a very small venture-backed company, I was looking for a CFO. In that situation, I'm working directly with the CEO. And like in most of these small companies, there's a very high degree of urgency. Now, there was no HR person involved because there was no HR person. So the company needed a lot of support from us. There was not a well-established hiring process. There was not a deeply evolved sense of what good due diligence looks like. So we provide that. I think the plus side for small companies is there are a limited number of people involved in the hiring process, and there's a high sense of urgency. So things tend to happen faster than they do at big companies. The pitfall that the small companies have to look out for is they usually don't have a good process. So if they're not careful, they can skip due diligence and end up with problems. With an example of a large company, it's kind of the mirror image. I did a head of regulatory affairs for a company that's a couple $2 billion recently. Very well-defined hiring process, largely shepherded by a senior HR leader. But in a larger company, there are more people involved. It tends to be a little bit more bureaucratic. I don't mean that in a judgy way. There are just a lot more rules and people involved, and that can slow things down. And I think that's the major pitfall that the large companies need to look for. They're usually going to do it right, but they need to make sure they do it fast enough so that they can run an effective search.
Interesting.
Yeah, I would just say that the great opportunity exists to when you have a problem in a company. Anytime you have a problem, generally that problem can be solved through a person. So when you have a company early stage we're talking to and they have a need, whatever that need may be, one of the keys to ending properly is starting with the end in mind and describing very clearly what the deliverables are. And I think a lot of times what happens is a technical founder understands their specific domain, and let's give them credit because this is where all the innovation happens. The big companies don't innovate anymore. So you have these little companies with an idea and the wherewithal to make something significant happen. And so, but their sphere of influence and knowledge tends to be pretty siloed. And so they may know what is needed in a general sense, but they may not know what's needed in a very specific sense. And I think that's when a lot of problems occur, is because they think, for instance, well, we're in an engineering phase right now, we need to transition into a commercial phase. And so very often what's not fully grasped is the specific nuance of what success looks like and what's needed for success to be achieved. You know, you just as an example, if you have a small company, it's very flat, you maybe have a handful of employees and you think we need a VP of sales. Well, a VP of sales is a term that can be, you know, it can be anything from an individual contributor all the way up to a vice president who manages directors. And if you go to a big company, VPs manage directors, directors manage managers, and managers manage individual contributors. So you just start to see that the way that titles are often used in very small companies can be misleading. And so it could be a disaster for you to hire someone who, let's say, is a VP of a department and typically used to managing a bunch of directors, to now all of a sudden consider that they're going to manage individual contributors, or perhaps even be a player coach and have to individually contribute on their own. So there's a lot of different ways of making mistakes here. And I think that's why a lot of people are somewhat reticent to go through this process. But it's important that you can really understand what success looks like and what's required for the individual to be successful.
That's Fascinating. And I'm curious for both of you, when you engage with a smaller company, are you typically engaged by and working with the CEO or not so much?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And
The exception to that would be if you're recruiting the CEO and then we're engaged by the board.
by the board, right?
Sure.
And when you are working with the CEO, how much coaching do you end up doing to help them understand what it even means to hire this role or that role? And let's pretend that these are maybe not as technical roles, and this is a technical founder. I mean, is this part of the job description? Is this what an entrepreneurial CEO should even expect, or not so much? How do you think about that relationship with your client, the CEO, as you help them build a team?
Yeah, I would say that's very accurate, Randy. When a CEO reaches out and has a need, generally I want to understand what the problem is and where the deficiency is. And oftentimes, just to cite a recent example, if they're telling me that they need a new head of sales per se, I need to understand what kind of product it is. Is it me too? Is it something that's disruptive? Because understanding the nuance is essential in understanding whom to attract. And then you can't find someone who's just sold, something where it's a commodity to try to sell something disruptive, something that requires a change that's so significant. If you consider, a physician changing an instrument from one instrument that might be, a high-speed drill to something else that is ultrasonic, I mean, you're just basically changing the golf club from the physician's hand to a different golf club. But if you change the behavior or a treatment algorithm, you're now talking about entirely changing the golf swing rather than just exchanging the club with a different brand.
And that might call for a completely different person. Is that
complete different set of skills?
Yeah.
And the entire calculus. So you really need to understand a lot of the nuances, and it's important to be able to really understand the product, the sale, and the call points, and all of those things are essential. So in a lot of times, the technical founders have an idea of some of this, but they might not fully grasp it, and they could, that's when you can run into some errors, because a lot of times the newness and the excitement is very attractive to someone who maybe hasn't done it before, but it just adds risk to the individual company to hire someone who hasn't actually done something disruptive before.
Right. Mike, do you have similar thoughts or experiences?
I think founders run the gamut. I've had founder clients who are on their third or fourth or fifth company, and frankly, they don't need a lot of coaching from me once they've got that much experience. On the other hand, I've had plenty who are first time, often very young, and they need help. And I think as recruiters, we have to be prepared to do whatever it takes to help the client. And if that means a lot of coaching, that's part of our job description.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm curious, are the engagements with smaller companies, do they tend to be one-offs just because they're cash constrained and their hair's on fire for so many different reasons, and having a consigliere relationship with Drue or Mike doesn't seem like there's enough hours in the day, or do you find some founders who recognize the importance of this and that they could use a little guidance?
It depends on the success of the company, really. When they're small and capital constrained, there's not a ton of retained search volume at these companies. But if they are successful and they grow, we can build a client that we stay with for a decade. And that becomes a client relationship that ends up with a lot of projects.
Right. And then I would imagine, to Drue's point, having a grounding in what the company is doing, who it's selling to, how it's selling, that you're going to have that, embedded in the relationship rather than having to learn it for the first time from a standing start.
Indeed.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that seems to me to be an important element here, or theme here, which is this idea that building the team, recruiting, retaining is never done, really, and therefore, especially if you don't have someone on staff who's thinking about this all the time, having a partner, external partner, can be really, really important. Yeah. Well, great. I'd like to switch slightly to this notion of culture, and I think again, I have to imagine there's a big difference between having a standing start engagement with a company where you really don't know the company, the products, the culture, the people, and one with whom you have been working for some time. It's just completely different for you. But let's talk about this mysterious word, culture. What is it? How do you get it? How do you mess it up? How do you, as an executive search resource, how do you factor it into the work you do, and how do you coach your clients to think about it to the extent they need coaching?
This is one of those fun areas, because a lot of times, when your hair is on fire and you're starting a company, you don't give a lot of thought to the culture. It just sort of, evolves. And a lot of times, when asked a question, about a company's culture, a lot of times they don't really know, and they kind of search for the words that best describe it. And what's interesting about that is, even if they don't have an intentional culture, there's definitely a culture. And so it's really important for them to start thinking about that well in advance of some of the hiring that they might be doing. And the idea that a company's culture is really, it defines a lot of times who they can hire. And so there's a question of, do they even have a grasp of their culture now, or can they describe it? And is it what they want it to be? Because sometimes you do want to bring someone in who melds well with the existing culture, and other times you might actually see it as an opportunity to sort of start to change and sort of mold a new culture. And so it's important at the start to kind of have an understanding of how you want to be able to leverage this new person, whether it's a fit in or if it's a transform kind of a model.
Interesting.
Yeah, I would underline that culture is very real. I have one client that calls it organ rejection when they bring someone in who is the wrong cultural fit. And before you start judging whether a candidate is a fit for your culture, you need to explicitly understand what your culture is, kind of building on Drue's point. Without a written and commonly understood definition of what your culture is, discussions about candidate fit can very quickly devolve into people like us. So who do we like? Or who would I go to a ball game with? And those are not useful definitions. In fact, I think they're commonly understood to be the enemy of diversity recruiting, which is something that is a business imperative today. So one of my clients, one which I think has the strongest culture I've ever seen in a company, went through the process of writing this down and defining their culture in terms of 8 traits that define behavior or candidate character. And they came up with things like humility, intellectual curiosity, customer orientation, and other stuff. And what is really interesting is they reported back that after this was on paper, it really grounded their discussions about whether someone was a fit in analysis, not just did I like that person or not like that person. And it also led to them hiring a more diverse group of people because they had defined culture in a very inclusive way. You could be anybody and be humble, or be anybody and be intellectually curious. So they're actually accessing a bigger pool of candidates.
That's fascinating. And I'm curious, was that list generated by one person, by the senior team? Was it somehow a consensus view of the larger team? Do you have a sense of how sort of shot through the organization those ideas are?
The process was led by a senior HR person, and they really built it from the ground up. It was not a top-down definition. It really came from the troops. And I think that made it more meaningful.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah.
I do think that culture is really super important. And when you're interviewing someone for a potential role in your company, I think it's something that you really do need to dig into and ask them very specific questions about their current role and the culture of their team. And not just that they can articulate it, but how did it get to that point? And what role did they play in effectuating that culture? Or are they just sort of bobbing along in the waves of culture, to really find out if they're going to be able to influence the proper culture, or if they're just going to come in and kind of meld. And it really speaks to leadership. And so if they can articulate not just the what, but the how and the why, then I think that really gives you some clarity around, what kind of value that they're going to bring to your culture.
Seems like a really important thing for first-time founders to put on their list of things they got to do.
That's a good point. And for very young companies, there may be no culture. So in that case, you can think of it as having the luxury of designing the culture that you want.
I would say that even if they don't think they have a culture, they absolutely do. They may not be aware of it. And that's sometimes why it's important to really cause them to think about it and define it, not just what it is, but what they want it to be, so that they can begin to start to map out that transition to get to the kind of culture that brings about the proper kind of mindset of the team. And ultimately, I think it's necessary.
Right. Well, to both your points, I mean, there's an awareness piece and there's an intention piece, and they may not if they're not aware, they need to get aware real fast. And if they are and they aspire to a culture that is in some ways different than the one they think they have at this time, then they have some work to do there. And I guess the overall point is that, to avoid that organ rejection, this needs to be top of mind, both as you think about what problems you're solving in people terms, and then as you get to know the people that could come in to solve those problems.
Yeah, there's a great quote by Drucker that says that culture eats strategy for breakfast.
I believe it.
I do too. Awesome. Great. Well, before we move on to some slightly more tactical questions, any further thoughts on culture, thinking again from the standpoint of either a very nascent company in culture, or perhaps a more established company, and maybe to put a finer point on the question, is there such thing as subcultures or departmental cultures in larger companies that, is that okay? Is that not okay? Is that, how do you think about that as you evaluate fit for someone in a larger place that might have not a homogeneous culture?
to this point about cultures being different in different pieces of a company, one of my larger clients has multiple divisions, and they're all located in different parts of the US. Each of them has a subtly different culture. You can tell they're related, but they're like siblings. They're each a little bit different. So when I'm working for different divisions, I need to bear that in mind and understand how each one is different. So yes, in large companies, the culture can fracture a little bit.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think that really culture reflects leadership. So when you have divisional leaders, you're going to find that there is a reflection of that individual leader in the culture of that team. And so it's why it's so important to have alignment among a leadership team, such that you can mitigate some of that factional kind of mentality.
Fascinating. And we have a number of questions coming in from the audience. One of which is on this topic. I'll just read it out. It says, sometimes the CEO thinks their culture is different than what the employees think. How often do you see this? How do you deal with it? How do you deal with it? Have you seen that?
Yes.
Very, very common. Very common in a startup, I will say, because they tend to be, the CEO, who's a technical founder, tends to be singularly focused on a product and a development project. And so they're so completely bought in to the vision and the mission that they can often get lost in it and lose some of the bigger picture and some of kind of how others are perceiving that. And so I think that, certainly seen some companies where you've got that technical founder who is, religiously committed to this endeavor and thinks everyone else is as well. And, just doesn't maybe have quite the self-awareness that some might. And so it can create some challenges. And I think that it really comes down to building trust with that individual and having the opportunity to start to share some of those ideas. And those opportunities are earned. And if you don't have the relationship with someone like that you can actually bring to light some concerns, it can be really difficult.
Yeah, I agree, Drew.
Awesome. So I actually want to take a little detour because there's another couple of questions that I think are interesting that really are around the idea of consultants and the extent to which recruiters can help with consultant hires. And maybe a more interesting and a bigger question embedded in that is this idea that, have you encountered a stated need for a role and you've decided, well, that's not really a job, or you help them realize that maybe that role isn't what they think it is, or it's not. This is going to get to our more tactical discussion of spec writing, but I'm just curious about the question of is there a role for search firms like yours in finding consultants or folks who are not, necessarily sort of W-2 employees in this domain?
Impeccable timing. This just happened to me last week. I received an email and a follow-up call with a CEO from the UK who was looking for a GM for the US. And as I listened to the role and the duties, I said, "Are you sure this is a full-time role?" And he said, "Well, what do you mean?" And I said, "Well, I don't think this is a full-time job. From the caliber of person you're looking for, I don't think they'll have enough to do." And there's a couple of people that come to mind who could do this for a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the time because of their connectivity to all the strategics at the level that you would need. And so that conversation went from, retained search for a GM of the US to probably a 1-year consulting contract for a guy that'll, obviously reduce my fee by significant, as well as what he's going to have to pay the individual. And I think that probably for the first year, that's probably all that is needed.
That's Yeah, was that a relationship that, a longstanding relationship you had
No,
with that client?
not
So
at
this is
all.
a
Just,
first time
yeah.
engagement.
Yeah, someone referred him to me, I think from his board, and so, just after listening again, it really comes down to, and I know Mike feels the same way. It's about listening to what the actual needs are, not the felt needs, and trying to help solve the problem in the safest and most efficacious way.
I agree, Drew. That happens quite often. For example, a small company might come and say, look, we've got these big strategic issues that we're facing in the regulatory domain. We need a VP of regulatory affairs. And when you listen to them, you learn that they need someone indeed who's got tons of experience and very deep strategic skills. And it's really to answer a pretty finite set of questions, and then they have to go execute. So in a situation like that, they really need to hire a very seasoned consultant to plot their strategy, and then they can have less expensive people who help to execute it. And that's the right approach. I don't place consultants as part of my practice, but I'm often in the situation where I'm sending clients off to look for one.
Yeah, great. So yeah, that's really interesting. So let's turn our attention now to this more tactical section, and let's talk about a spec. I have this vague sense that that's how we start things when we do searches, but is it? Should it be? Why is a spec necessary? Is it, what makes a good one? Do good ones differ depending on context? Or can you just download it from the internet and send it to Drew or Mike? How does a spec work, and what's a good process vis-a-vis a spec, in your opinion?
Well, I can tell you that I think it serves a purpose. I think from an internal perspective, it's a great way to get the team aligned around what's needed, and clearly defining the roles and responsibilities and the deliverables. I think that's important. Is it what we do is create a profile where we collaborate with our clients. So they give us their spec, and then we sort of bring in some of the story behind the company, the why behind the company, and the impact that the role will play beyond just a list of must-haves and nice-to-haves. So so again, it's about alignment on the team such that you have that lens by which to evaluate the potential candidates that come in. And then it's also a useful thing to be able to share with a potential candidate to sort of show a summary of the company, kind of the role that's looking to be filled, kind of the skill sets that are believed to be essential, and then kind of a little bit of a, it's almost a sell sheet to compel someone who isn't looking to sort of, tap them on the shoulder and have them be open to taking a look and having an exploratory conversation. So I think they're useful. A lot of clients don't have them because I'm working with such early stage companies, and that's okay too. But I think when you can get everyone aligned behind a very clear message of what the role is and does, I think that's valuable.
I agree. I guess I'd start by defining what it is. The position description is really two things. It's number one, a description of what the job is, and number two, it's a specification for what candidates look like. How many years of experience, what domain, types of companies, et cetera, et cetera. I think if the hiring manager cannot summarize those things in one page, that's a problem. Length is the enemy of knowing what you're really looking for. So you should be able to do it succinctly. And then lastly, to Drew's point on building consensus, the spec becomes a tool to drive consensus. So you need to make sure that everyone who's going to be involved in this hiring process is on the same page and measuring candidates with the same yardstick. So they need to review this document in advance and really take it in. They can't just say, yeah, that's fine. You want to make sure that they're in agreement. And it's important to also bring in your boss or your board, if you are the CEO, so that they are in agreement with what you're doing. There are two classic things that happen when there's no consensus. The first one is that, say, a panel of 4 people meet a candidate and they all come back with different opinions. That's a sign that they're not measuring the candidate using the same yardstick. Everyone's looking for something different. And the second bad thing that can happen is that you send the final candidate to the board or your boss for the pro forma courtesy meeting, and they veto your choice. And I had that happen.
Ouch.
I had that happen a number of years ago. We were doing a VP of marketing search. We're prepared to make the offer. Everything's done. And the CEO took it to his board, and a board member objected and scuttled the whole process. So those are the things that go wrong if you don't drive consensus using the spec.
Yeah, really, really makes sense to me. I'd like to turn to a slightly related topic, which is this idea of, for growing companies, there can be a temptation and maybe a legitimate reason to bring in seasoned or more experienced executives who might come from a larger company in the same domain, and say, you know what, we've really hit a turning point in our maturity, and now it's time to bring in this amazing woman who ran sales wherever. I can imagine in some cases that could work great, because you bring a degree of professionalism and experience and network and all those other great things that seasoned executives have. I've also seen real dumpster fires in the startup phases when there's a sort of mismatch between the experience and expectations of the executive and that of the company, some of which revolve around almost funny things like whether or not they have a big enough expense account, but some of which do not. They're pretty serious disconnects. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the sort of pros and cons and the timing of when layering in a more seasoned executive into a startup or a growing startup. And let's assume that it's actually not a wholly inappropriate time to be bringing in an experienced executive. But how do you gauge that fit and whether that's going to take or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll tell you, we have a phrase here that we use, that experience can be very deceptive. And you can see someone that looks amazing. And if you're a technical founder and you've got this little company and you envision your product someday being acquired by a J&J or Stryker, it's easy to get caught up in potentially attracting someone from one of those big companies to help you as a company to sort of navigate to that future. The problem is that if it's someone who's been at a very big company like that, they're accustomed to the type of resources that they would never have in your company. And they may not even realize it because they're so embedded in it. It's just sort of, just part of the ether. So what happens is, in many cases, is you bring someone like that in, and as they start to actually make movement and start to do things, they start to realize that they're actually doing stuff and are required to do stuff they haven't done for 15 years. Because they've already operated at such a high strategic level, they're now doing things through people. And when you're at kind of that 0 to 10 million, it's a very different set of skills required. And what I have found is that it's kind of rare to be able to get someone who can kind of go from the 0 to 10 or 15 or 20 million. And it's rare that that person can actually take it all the way to 50. So it's not uncommon to need someone to get company kind of started from 0 to 10 or 20, and then a new person to get it to 50. And that a lot of companies I find plateau at 50 million. And because that style of work scales to about that point. And then there's a different set of skills. We talked about it earlier. We said that, VPs manage directors, directors manage managers, and managers manage individual contributors. It's a different skill set each step above on that rung. So when someone, let's say, is at a big company and they're managing directors, they haven't managed individual contributors in a long time. And so it's a very difficult digression to go back and do that again. And then you add to that just scarce resources. You need people who can really make much of a very finite resource. And I would submit to you that it's rare that those people are coming from big companies. So that's my observation.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, Drew. I think the root of the problem is that startups and entrepreneurs are glorified in our culture. So there are a lot of people within large companies who think they want to work in a startup.
Exactly.
And they actually have no idea what it means. So I'm reminded of this meeting I had years ago with a candidate. Now, this guy was out of a big company. I was recruiting him for a very small company. And I'm probing on working in a small company, and he gave all the right answers. Yes, I want to be in a small company. Yes, I can roll up my sleeves. And then when we finished that discussion, he said, and this was his tell, so what kind of administrative support am I going to have? And the answer, of course, was none. Your own two hands, because there's nothing. You're going to make your own travel. You're going to empty your own wastebasket. And that's the way it is in the startup.
Yeah. And the fact that you asked the question at all tells us maybe all we need to know.
Indeed. Indeed.
Yeah. So one of the ways you mitigate that is by just really asking them very, very specific questions as you get further along in the process relative to their strategy. So you want to know kind of what would they do in the first 6 months. What does that look like to them? And it's, kind of sometimes it's a 6 month or a year or 1 to 3 years. And you want to know specifically what are the resources that they would want to hire? What are the people, what kind of tools do they need to be successful to achieve the goals that are laid out before them? And it's pretty typical that you're going to be able to sniff that out because they're going to be looking to hire people really quick. When that, in an early stage company, that's not generally the plan. So that's just one way of vetting that.
Yeah,
Right.
what an interesting topic. Let's pivot slightly to the really juicy one, which is how do you know when it's time to, how do you know when something's failed? A placement has failed. How do you think about it? How do you coach your client to think about it? How do you coach them? How do you coach them to react? Whether it's a hire from a big company or whatever, but just the general category of what to do when it didn't quite work.
So let's define what you mean. For the context of this discussion, let's stipulate that we're talking about someone who is a relatively recent hire, say within the last year. So how does a CEO know that that's a failure? I think it probably falls into two bins. One is performance-based, a failure to deliver what they promised to deliver. And if they're not doing that and they're not doing it early, it probably isn't going to get better. The second one are problems of behavior. And I've not been directly involved in situations like that, but I've heard plenty of incidences where a candidate comes on board and there's just a toxic personalities or disruptive behavior that is creating problems. So in either of those situations, I think you have to act and move as at the earliest possible moment. I think the more interesting question is, how did you get in that position? So what, because by definition, something went wrong in your assessment and due diligence on that candidate. So if you find yourself in that position, act, but really analyze and try to figure out what happened so you can avoid it, pardon me, can avoid it happening again. And I guess I'd make one last observation, that it's not uncommon to see a situation where the same job is churning over and over again. And that reminds me of an anecdote from a book that was written by Bill George, who was the CEO of Medtronic years ago. And in this anecdote, which was allegedly true, there was a CEO who was getting divorced for the third time. And he went to a therapist to figure out why he had a wife selection problem. And the therapist said, the good news is you don't have a wife selection problem. The bad news is you have a husband behavior problem. And if you're the CEO or the hiring manager and you're churning the same job over and over again, the odds are it's you. So you really want to look in the mirror and figure it out.
Yeah, it's great advice. Drue, what do you think?
So, I think that there's different reasons that people don't work out, as Mike just said. So you've got, when there's an issue of compliance, that today, that seems to be kind of a showstopper. So if there's a compliance violation or an HR issue, those tend to have zero tolerance. So those are just kind of easy decisions. And, the line in the sand is drawn and you just have to act immediately. You get to other areas, and maybe they're a little more gray. Performance shouldn't be gray, but performance and culture together, if the performance is off, it kind of makes you take a deeper look at everything else, and it kind of highlights a problem. And so it does give you the ability to kind of take an assessment. And I've just had a client that hired 2 AVPs on their own, and then brought us in to do some cleanup. And one they fired after 4 months. And it was a scenario where he came in and he took some, he took some people out really quick. And so that kind of raised the, suspicion a little bit. And then after that, performance was very, very poor. So, they decided that, that had seen enough. And so I'd say I applaud them for what was a very difficult decision, which was to move quickly and remove the individual. And because what typically happens is they'll abide in a situation that they know inherently isn't working. And they tend to take too long to take an action where taking that action is actually going to help. And it did help in this case. It helped the company's culture. It helped sort of give life to some people who are feeling very concerned about their futures and unnecessarily. Right. So I think you have to look at the big picture, look at what's the effect it's having on a company or a division or a group of people. And there's certain things that can be talked through and coached, but in the absence of change after that step has been taken, I think more often than not, people wait too long to make that decision. It's a hard decision, and it's, there's humanity involved, and you want to be fair to people and so forth. But at the same time, in your company, you've got a lot more to think about beyond the one individual. You got to think about the company, the trajectory of the company, and the culture again, getting back to that point. So I would say
Really
more often than
holistic,
not, it's waiting too long to pull the trigger.
Yeah. Great. We are unfortunately running out of time. Got a couple more questions I want to field from the audience, but I'd like to give you a chance. Well, let's do this. In the last 5 minutes, let's do this. One of the questions I think is particularly poignant for startups that are that are led by folks who may not have done this before, and the question really revolves around the difficulties founders have, whether they're technical or not, in sort of firing themselves, kicking themselves upstairs, realizing, admitting joyfully or otherwise that they may not, maybe not the best CEO for the next phase. If you could just address, how your experience in this world, how you would coach a CEO early on to be thinking ahead about continual reassessment of their own skills and abilities to be that leadership for whatever phase is. And then after that, I'd like to finish by asking you about how clients of all kinds, big, small, otherwise, can best think of you guys as partners and resources rather than as one-off transactions. But let's tackle the sort of the always difficult, am I the right CEO for the job question as a startup.
I think if you're asking that question, you're already way ahead of the game because most don't. And I think the bottom line is that a founder CEO needs to figure out if he or she is more interested in success or control. And if you want to be successful and you're the right person to lead the company forward, great. And if you're not, you need to have enough self-awareness and self-confidence, frankly, to fire yourself and put yourself in a different role.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, that's perfect. Well said, Mike. I think that again goes back to hanging on too long. I would say where I've seen people make the mistake is staying too long, and they might pay lip service to being willing to, at the right time, step aside, and that right time just never seems to materialize. So I think Mike made a great point that are you more interested in success or control? Because you do have to make that decision.
Yeah. Well, words to take to heart. Well, let's close out by just giving the audience a sense of the sort of spectrum of engagement of firms like yours, from the one-off, hey, we haven't worked together before, but we need an X, Y, or Z, all through a sort of continuing relationship where you have a better sense of culture, product, market, just because you've been working with this client for a long time.
So I'll start. I think that, first of all, let me define where I think recruiters add value. Identification of candidates is not where recruiters add value. That's a commodity. I could pay one of my children $100 and they could come up with a good candidate list for any search I'm working on. So where do recruiters add value? Number one, it's in selling your company to prospective candidates so that they are willing to talk. They're all busy, they're successful. Why should they talk to you?
The ones you want. Yeah.
The ones you want.
Yeah.
And number two, they add value by assessing who's going to be a good fit in your culture. And both of those value adds require a pretty deep understanding of your company, what it does, why it's different, why someone would want to work there, and who fits. So I think the winning model for using recruiters is to build relationship equity in one or more firms who really get to know your business inside out. And and then you have a very powerful relationship. One of my clients, the most flattering thing a client said to me in the last bunch of years was, "You know us better than we do." And when you have a good recruiter relationship, that's what you can expect.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Drue, take us out.
Yeah, that was well said, and I agree on all points. I think that really, as a CEO, as a leader, I think you need to just constantly be thinking, beyond what the tyranny of the urgent might suggest to you. And if you're at a point where you need to hire somebody right now, you have missed it. I mean, you're too late. And I think, to Mike's point, you should be investing time into discovering which search firm is a good fit for your company, such that they can articulate a very solid process and that it resonates with you. And then from there, you really need to invest time in explaining your vision and the company's mission and your exit strategy, and make sure that they're on board and they want to participate with you, because you should be thinking well in ahead of time about the needs that you might have. And that's part of what being a CEO is. And as a technical founder, you tend to get somewhat myopic at times. That tends to be the process, but you have to start thinking long range. And so the sooner you can involve a search firm in just ideation and discovery about, what does it look like to hire, build a team, or to expand, or to go into a different discipline. All of that can be very helpful as you craft your strategy. So I do it all the time. I'm just, getting to know people and trying to understand what it is that they are going to need to do. And sometimes I talk to them and it's 3 years before they're going to need somebody. Yeah. So it's never too early.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you both. I think that's a great way to wrap things up on the importance of thinking ahead about, this key piece of building a business. Drue and Mike, I'm really appreciative. Thank you on behalf of the foundation for giving us this time, these thoughts. There's a lot of great wisdom here that I think founders and even, managers in much larger enterprises can take to heart. So we really appreciate it. We certainly look forward to availing ourselves of your wisdom as we try to help build the focused ultrasound therapeutics space. So thank you again.
My pleasure. Thanks for having us.
All right. Thanks all.